Hi, welcome everybody to Artful Tuesdays. I'm joined by my co-host, Ann Ciccolella, and we have a special guest, Sandra Shaw. And we're going to be, who's a sculptor, art historian, author, and lecturer. We're going to be talking about her work, and we're going to be talking about a talk and some panels she's doing at an upcoming conference, Resurrecting Romanticism, from October 8th through the 9th, or 7th through the 9th, October 7th through the 9th in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And just real quick before, I did want to plug one thing, because for those of you, especially in Austin or Texas, come on down, because we are, or Anne, I shouldn't say we, I'm not really doing anything with this, but Anne and Austin Shakespeare is putting on Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, a reading of it. And Anne, can you just real quick say when that is and who's doing it?
It is Mark Pellegrino, your friend from ARUK, and it opens December 8th and closes December 10th. It's, when we do a reading, he just will, he'll put it all in your mind. It's all going to happen in your imagination. It's not what you would think, but thank you for the plug, Kirk.
Yeah, it won't be a fully staged thing, but it'll be a dramatic reading by a professional, wonderful actor who y'all know and love. Okay, so Sandra, thank you for joining us.
No, thanks very much.
I'm very excited to talk about these sculptures. So those of you watching us, we're going to be looking at actual sculptures, and we're going to be talking about Sandra, particularly her talk. We're not going to give you everything because you need to go see the talk, but we're going to give you some teasers and help you enjoy a sculpture a little bit more. And Sandra, your talk is called Romantic Realist Sculpture in the Industrial Age. And I just want to say, I really loved your book. We talked about it before on the show, so I brought it out again, got all my notes and stuff. Windows on Humanity, a history of how art reflects
Everybody
our
has
ideas.
a copy.
Yeah, you better have a copy. Everyone should have a copy. It's wonderful because it's, there's a lot of this stuff you're not going to, you might see here and there, but it just brought together really well with the different images. And she has, quotes from poets and philosophers and historians like Pindar. So I love it. It's wonderful. I love all the integration and such. And, just as a kind of contrast, we're not going to talk about the book as much this time. We have another video about it. But just as an example, there's a whole chapter on Egypt as kind of, the art is coming out of their death worship in a sense. And they're, and that, so when you explore their art, you really get into their philosophy and their outlook. So fast forward thousands of years now, and using that same kind of lens that Sandra is utilizing, we could do the same thing with the industrial era. So I just wanted to let you kind of set up a little bit, kind of the overall view, and then we'll look at these sculptures, Sandra, of what do you think is going on in the industrial era that's really leading to this new type of sculpture we're going to be looking at?
Well, the industrial era is in the afterglow of the Enlightenment. It's when men are applying reason to life, and they're doing it successfully, and there's lots of evidence that they're successful. So by the time you get to the 19th century sculptors, they're aware of how a successful man is, how excellent he can be, how innovative he is when he uses reason. And that is a tremendous inspiration and source for 19th century romantic sculpture. Now, I have to qualify that it's romantic because there's lots of 19th century sculpture that is not romantic. The 19th century is an eclectic period. It's very mixed intellectually, and therefore the art is mixed. And what I do for the talk is I curated, selected out artworks that are specifically romantic. And I'm leaving out the full spectrum of the 19th century. I'm leaving it out to put in my book. But for the talk, I'm leaving out quite a bit of that context in order to zero in on the romantic works.
Yeah, so you're thinking about, oh, please, Anne, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, So when I think of 19th century sculpture, I think of Daniel Chester French.
Yes.
Is he romantic for you?
Some of his work is.
And how would you define romanticism in a how do you use that tool?
Well, I heavily rely on Ayn Rand's treatment of this topic. And it's sculpture that in some way shows that man is volitional, that he's self-determined, he's self-actualized, he's not a pawn of divine forces or blind passion. He's getting on in life using his mind. Now that's a lot.
Yeah, it's
and
a big topic.
One might wonder, how could sculpture show that? After all, sculpture shows a frozen body without any context of a setting or any dramatization over time, the way a performing art shows us or literature describes. And what I provide is opportunities to examine 19th century romantic sculpture and discuss it and, describe its features and hone in on those aspects that do indicate that man is volitional.
So we're going to see some images today, and you'll explain how that works. That's great.
Yes. Kirk asked for a sneak preview of some of the pieces that I'm going to show. So
great.
And because it is something I'm always been confused and still, to be honest, struggling with it. In understanding Ayn Rand, I've read Romantic Manifesto many times, and I understand how it applies to her field of novels, but I'm really trying to rely and learn from you and Diane and others of how this applies, Luke Travers, how it applies to how romantic in particular, and Ayn Rand's definition of romanticism applies to the visual arts and even poetry. For me, is very difficult in trying to, grasp this, because again, when you see like a novel, even a Dostoevsky, you could see like obviously the inner world of them struggling through their ideas. They're taking these actions. So it's like, okay, when she says free will is the essence of romanticism, volition. Okay, I could see these people, Jean Valjean is struggling and he's trying to come up. But like you were saying earlier, it's just, it's a great statue. It's a great sculpture. He's struggling with a snake or something. How is that romanticism, right? Like that's something interesting. So
right, and some works are mixed cases or gray areas. And also there are pre-industrial age sculptures that have romantic elements. I would argue that Michelangelo's David has a romantic quality to it, where he's not in the blind throes of battle. He's sizing up his foe. He's focused on his mark, and he seems to be contemplating and thinking. So he's open to choice. But it's diluted in that it is, after all, a biblical hero, and there's all of that baggage with it. But on the face of it, if you were to say, well, this was a secular product, does it have romantic elements? Yes, absolutely. So that can be a bit confusing. Then in the 19th century, you have a romantic outlook being embodied in a more pure form with fewer opposed values involved. And I think that's chiefly because it's secular. Cool. And there isn't that tie to the idea that man is somehow a product or a servant of a divine will.
Okay, so let's
see some images.
Yeah, let's go ahead and
I think that the Bernini equestrian really dramatizes.
Okay, let's look at that
this idea of a divine force at play in human life.
What can you set that up while Daniel is getting that? What era are we looking
This
at?
is 17th century Baroque. It's Bernini was the top sculptor of that era. No, that's Saint. Yeah, that's the St. Peter's.
On the horse, the man on the horse.
Yeah,
Man on the horse.
There you go.
Thanks, Daniel.
So here you have Louis the 14th. I hope I have this right, because I just threw this at you this morning when you asked for images. So
okay.
My keen memory is that this is Bernini's portrayal of Louis the 14th, the sun god on horseback, and you can see, and he's got the wig and all. You don't really get a sense that he's a human being who is riding his horse for a specific goal or purpose. He's kind of on display to us. He's not really looking where he's going. Horse has has a fantastical quality to it. There seem to be flames beneath.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. What is that?
You have this broiling drapery that suggests levitation and not a world of gravity. So there's this fantastical quality, and the horse's mane and tail are unnaturally curvaceous, echoing the curves of the flame. And the artist hasn't spent time examining a horse too carefully, or what flames look like, or how drapery responds to form in a weight, a world of weight. So there is and I don't remember what he's got on his head, but this symbolic of divine power.
I think he actually has a pigeon.
No, but there's something else.
I think this one does have a pigeon on it. So,
but he doesn't.
I don't think that's part of the statue, though.
He looks like the horse is carrying him, but he doesn't. Your purpose thing really works well here, Sandra, because it doesn't look like he's directing the horse.
Yeah,
it looks like he's being carried by the craziness of the horse.
Well, we do know, like, about Louis the 14th, like that was one of the things he commissioned to like try to elevate him in the image of his people at that time, right? To make him look like a sun god, and he was part of this
divinely chosen.
Yeah, and you get that from this. I see what you're saying. I don't know if I would have seen that, for sure, but I think that's when on my own. But definitely when you point it out, I don't know what's on his head either. But yeah, and that's not how I don't ride horses much. But the way he looks also is not. Like I've seen sculptures and I went to see people playing polo where they're really focused, right? Like someone who's riding and they're like going.
That's a good contrast.
Yeah. And he's just like he's daydreaming and just hanging out, nothing big deal. He's not going to war. He's not, going forward, not even delivering the mail. He's not doing anything, right? He's just kind of lying back on, just, look at me.
But that was very helpful, Sandra. It does have that.
You're
almost heavenly look. That's
absolutely.
And if we could go to the St. Andrew, the St. Peter's portrayal of St. Andrew. Again, now he's not being portrayed as a divine ruler, but he's being portrayed as someone whose whole frame of reference is some higher authority or divine force, something greater than him. He's looking up. He has a gaping open mouth, which gives you a sense of an awestruck individual. He is. He's looking
he's like
up
holding
at
on.
God. The gesture implies surrender or reception. If you didn't know anything about the cross, one would wonder, why is he holding this massive cross? It has nothing to do with having a life or pursuing any, this worldly values, unless he's going to build a bridge. But I mean, it just doesn't, there's just nothing here that's showing us man on earth able to find his way and seek his values on earth by his own power.
Well, in an era when we're all interested about men's pecs, it's interesting to look at his chest versus Louis' chest.
It's heavily, the torso is heavily borrowed from Hellenistic models, which is the case with Renaissance and post-Renaissance works. They were looking to, many of them were looking to Hellenistic prototypes like Laocoon, the Belvedere torso and whatnot, and then using them in this new way.
So like, well, one, I want to, I guess, ask this about, so your talk is, and we're going to get to the 19th century and industrial revolution, and there's a shift, right? Before we do that, I do want to let you have a say, because someone listening might get the sense that there's no value to these other artworks, right? And that's not what you're saying. I don't think,
no.
Right? Like,
no,
we're looking at it from a romanticist version, but these are still great works of art that we just looked at.
Absolutely, yeah. And these are, and particularly in my talk, I distinguish romantic sculpture from pre-industrial age works to highlight what an achievement it was. But in no way am I suggesting that there's no value to works that predate the industrial age. There's absolutely fantastic works of art. And you just have to be judicious in, asking yourself, what is this giving me? What is it actually showing me?
Mm-hmm.
And is that of value to me? And there are Christian images that can be of value as long as you put it in perspective. And
well, you can have an emotional response and an emotional experience for sure.
Yes. Now, I'm not of the view that any emotional experience is valid. I'm big on asking yourself, is your emotional response, fully rational, or are you engaging in some sort of indulgence? So
it could be an association.
I'm sorry.
Sure. It could be an association. Could look like your uncle.
Yeah, and certainly we shouldn't censor ourselves in how we respond to things. We're not morally responsible for our feelings. We have feelings, and the chief important issue is your own happiness, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And why are you feeling that is interesting.
Could and you want to make it objective. What are you responding to? Why? What's there? Is it really there in the artwork, or am I projecting something onto it that has more to do with me? That whole process is very, very enriching.
Yep.
Absolutely. I remember Marianne Suarez would say that when she looked at images that had a road in them, that there was something about that road going somewhere really just spoke to her in an emotional way.
Yeah.
Could you just talk for a minute about that title, Resurrecting Romanticism, in your context? Meaning, are we looking at, and you don't have to tell us today because we should have people go to the conference, but do you look toward the 21st century? Will you talk about, are there any romantic sculptures today? What do you think about the title? Resurrecting Romanticism.
Well, that particular discussion I'm going to save for the panel. In terms of
what's the panel
called? Resurrecting Romanticism in Art.
Okay.
So that's going to focus on
the second day for
the future.
This is one about education for new artists today, essentially, right? That's what that panel's
I
about?
actually have a different take on it than.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I mean,
we're going to have to have you after
I'll
this
just
is
make the
done.
blanket statement that I don't think that our challenge is teaching art.
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that. I would love to know.
Because we already know technically how to make great art. That knowledge has not been extinguished, and that we're currently in a technical revival that started in the mid 1980s. So that process is underway. My fear is that revival is not based on much more than traditionalism.
Oh, cool.
And
so it's the mechanics.
It's vulnerable. And so we need something deeper than training in art. And you can imagine what that deeper thing is.
That's
absolutely.
That's
well, that sounds like an exciting panel.
You gave it away now, but we'll have to have you all on.
You're special.
It's great.
So.
It's great. It's great. See,
There'll
that
be
was
a lot
the
more at the
pow.
top.
That was the kaboom.
Yeah, that was just the teaser to go get
you
the
wanted a blast.
teaser trailer. Yeah, you want all the fuel, you want it all. Okay, so let's look at some of the industrial era as a comparison to what we just saw a few minutes ago. So we saw images that, the first one was kind of this divine king, Louis XIV. He's floating on a fiery cloud type thing and looking up, not very forward moving, right? So let's have a contrast to those two sculptures. Which one would you choose?
The archer would
be okay. Daniel, if you don't mind pulling that up, please.
Yeah, there he is. Wonderful, wonderful work. This is Teucer, who was a mythic Greek archer. Homer describes.
Could you spell that for us?
Teucer, but pronounced Teucer. And interestingly, in the myth, apparently he's known as an excellent archer, a superb archer, but he fails, I think, eight or nine times to hit his mark in a particular situation. But in the 19th century, you have artists who are interpreting characters from literature in a new way. And we don't see any evidence in this statue of failure or impending failure. That's not what interested this artist. This artist wanted to show human excellence. He wanted to show goal-directed action, and he is embodying it in terms of the physical goal-directedness, which we see in the pose and the gesture, the direction of the arms, and the direction of his face, but also in his facial expression, which is this intense focus on his mark. And
but it's a confident focus. It's not strain. It's not like he's squinting. At least doesn't look
right.
Like
There's no evidence of inability or that he's somehow guided by some force other than himself. You really get a sense of him being in command of what he's doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Everything into it.
Oh.
Who's the artist?
Thornycroft.
Would you spell that for us?
Is that
THORNYCROFT?
Thornycroft. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
That looks
first
good.
Name Hamo, HAMO. Thornycroft.
Yeah.
And what is it? Silver? What is the material it's made from?
This is in bronze. He did and this would be a statuette, smaller than life. The original was in plaster, life size. And as far as I understand, this was a non-commissioned work, which is a feature of industrial age art, because you have such affluence, and we can get into this later if you like. There's such growth and affluence that markets for art are expanding, growing, and artists can afford to make non-commissioned works that please themselves, that interest them, as opposed to catering to the interests of a patron, which prior to the industrial age was either the church or the court, the monarchies. So here you have in the industrial age independent professional artists suiting themselves, enjoying creating work that interests them, that reflects their values, their outlook, and that enables them to bring their own personal interpretation to subjects. And it's so interesting that they, even when their subjects, if they're drawn from literature, are, say, of a doomed character, they don't portray them as doomed. They zero in on their independence, their excellence.
There's so I find that really interesting, because it kind of de-emphasizes the idea of failure, and even the focus is the journey, in a sense, right? It's like the doing of it, and doing it to the utmost of your ability, is what you the sense you get. And yes, I think if you know the story of Teucer in the Iliad, you get the idea that there are things that can go wrong. So I think in Teucer, this is where he's trying to shoot Hector specifically, and Apollo won't let him, right? And that's the issue. But I think it's wonderful that he's, like you're mentioning, he has this, he's doing his job, he's doing it, he's the best at what he does, he's forward looking, and he doesn't have control over everything, but he has control over what he has control over, and he's mastering that, or he's mastered that. And the reality may get in the way sometimes, or whatever. But yeah, go ahead.
The artist has selected out from the work of literature, the poem, what's important to him, and what's important to him is this man's excellence, his ability, his efficacy, and that is reflective of the general outlook of that era, in the afterglow of the Enlightenment, and at a time of great flowering of industry, of obvious human efficacy in all manner of life, including affluence.
Well, just as an example of what he could have done, right, is he easily could have him in after the shot, in the same position as he's watching it, and he could have a look of disappointment, right?
Yes.
He could easily draw that with the very similar, or he'd probably change the body a little bit, maybe a little deflated. You could still see the beauty of his form. He could still have great muscles, but it would just change. And if you were the artist, you could do that. So the idea of defeat could easily be in the same image, or not the same, this image, but
of his physique could suggest, oh, what could have been.
Yes. Yeah.
Rather than what is and can be, because man is capable of this.
Okay, so I have a question from the audience from Super Chat. I don't think any of us will have a good answer for this, but I'll say it because thank you, Gene Walters, for putting money down. So he paid for this. Any recommendation for a video game developer who wants to introduce romantic art to that audience?
Nope.
Yeah, I don't think so. Anybody.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. But thank you, Gene, for
Can I make a suggestion? If you go on Twitter, there's a guy called Richard Garriott de Cailleux, Cayeaux, who was a very early video game developer, and he's on Twitter all the time. And I would think, ask those people who are in that genre. I think that would be interesting. But thank you. That's a really exciting question.
Yeah, thank you, Gene. I do have comments for some other time on video game stuff, but and Richard,
I have one thing to say about the video games, and that is that there's absolutely great talent in video game, in the visuals of video game development. And when you have a culture like ours, where there's not a lot of market for art, like real artists, fine artists, you end up with great talent going into places like motion picture film, video game imagery. And so there's some really fantastic work in that area.
I just have to say, if you are interested, Gene, I would definitely recommend playing a game called Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which goes through ancient Athens, and you see sculptures everywhere. And there's, I've even seen YouTube videos of Greek anthropologists looking at it and saying like, yeah, this is like, it's very accurate and it's beautiful. And it like sets you into this world of how different the Greeks were, because especially in Athens, because everywhere is wonderful sculptures. You cannot fathom it like until you, and I think that's one of the joys of the game.
Cities were forests of
exactly how the game is. Yeah.
Sure.
So that's wonderful. So thank you, Gene, for the question. Maybe we'll do an Artful Tuesday in the future on video games. Okay. So, all right. So, Sandra, a couple more things. One, did you have another one of these sculptures we could look at as contrast from the other two? So we have this guy who I really like, of his forward movement, because I want to also just lastly kind of explore a little more about how this portrays free will specifically. So it definitely portrays the idea of there's he's focused. So I see that, I see determination, I see his ability, his knowledge, but what in that is specifically free will, or volition, which is about choices, right? It's about like, I could go this way or that way. And how does this portray that? And that's the challenge to me.
And it's by implication.
Okay.
So it's by implication, and we derive it by comparing Tusser to what we already know about human beings, and specifically archers. It's also, and it involves the absence of elements that would suggest that he's being guided from something other than himself.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Thank you. Go ahead.
And that's part. How you cope with this issue. That's how we assess art, is to compare it to what we already know.
Yeah. Okay. So you're kind of saying there's in previous art that comes before this, you see that divine element where that's what's directing you. That's what's authoring you.
Yes.
Here, partially because of the lack of that.
He's
directing himself, which means he's making a decision between cowering, between running away. He's made the decision.
And it's a combination of all of the elements. Concentrated expression on his face, the direction of his head, shows you that this is an action of his mind, in addition, guiding his body.
Yes.
And we know that because of what we already know about human beings and archers.
Well, let's look at my favorite one, if that's okay, the kiss, because I like romance.
Yes,
so I love this one.
Yes.
Why don't you describe it a little bit for us?
Well, this was originally part of a larger work called The Gates of Hell, and it was meant to portray a doomed couple. Francesca and Paolo from
Dante. Francesca and Paolo. Yep.
Yeah.
Dante.
Which is not romantic at all. But interestingly, this became a standalone sculpture. It was commissioned and reproduced and sold as a standalone work in Rodin's lifetime. So Rodin eventually treated it as a standalone work. And I think that it's so fine a piece that it can be, treated as a standalone without the baggage of its history. This is just such a fantastic work of art.
Well, it's so interesting because I'd really want to look around. I've never seen this before you introduced it, so thank you. I've read Dante. I actually really like it. And so I'm very familiar. It's one of the most famous stories from it. And I've seen it all over the place in art. And this depiction is such an interesting one because it's very opposite to what actually happens in Dante, where basically Paolo is crying on the bed and Francesca has her book and she's arguing why they're here in hell, right? Why they got here, because they got murdered by her husband who caught them in bed. And she's blaming Sir Lancelot in the story that she's reading. But I don't this is almost before they get murdered, in real life, in a sense, right? This is what I could imagine was happening in that bed before they were caught. And so I see nothing that indicates that this is actually Francesca and Paolo, actually. I wonder what, other than the title.
And this is another example of how artists could take subjects from literature that are doomed and interpret them in a new way where there isn't evidence that they're doomed. Now, apparently tucked in a corner is a book.
Okay, that would do it for me.
Which supposedly, but
especially if it fell off the bed or something. Because the whole point is that she's saying that to Dante, that this is why we did this affair. It's the fault of the book. We got seduced by it.
Right. So, but it's interesting that he tucks it away. I don't see it right now, and what's being emphasized is this, passionate mutual ardor and tenderness. And I think that it's a dramatization of intimacy. Yeah. And all of what that implies. I mean, if you look at his right hand on her thigh, that's a study in intimacy. The way he touches her, his fingers aren't digging into her flesh. There's nothing forced here. No one's taking advantage of anyone. There's no sense of compulsion. This is two healthy, youthful lovers expressing their love for each other. With all of what that implies, it implies a world in which they can have intimacy in an unforced encounter like this.
Absolutely.
So it screams volition to me. But if you were to put it into these, the gates of hell, it would be a very different vision.
I thank you for introducing me to this one, because I don't know if I've seen it before, but I love it. So, but I do see this issue of free will, especially if you're doing this in contrast. I'd really want to see the grander work, because I wonder if there's something where, he's stressing that the choice that they made to have this affair, right? As kind of that's part of what he's stressing here, is that it's not their over, like you're saying. Part of what I'm saying is I've seen the kisses where, you mentioned this beautifully done often where the man is gripping her thigh and you could see it indenting, which to me always indicates a level of heightened passion. And this is a passionate thing, but it's like you're saying, more tender, and it's more mutual. Yeah. And it's more both of them are on the same wavelength and level. He's not so intense, which is a good thing to dramatize itself in other contexts. But this is just a really good example of they're just in the sense of this one moment,
right?
Or this tragedy that's out of their control.
And the only way we can make sense of this is if we already know something about love, sex, an adult relationship, how a woman responds to a man when she's choosing to be with him.
Yes.
There's no evidence that this is, these are, that they're writhing in a fit of blind passion, or
that they have no control over,
driven by some force that,
Yeah. No, that's really good. I never thought of it that way. And so I'm, the talk you're going to be giving in the whole conference, Resurrecting Romanticism, will help, I think, attendees really see this idea of free will, volition, and what Ayn Rand was talking about when she was applying it primarily to literature, but how it applies to the visual arts, and I think music a bit as well, correct? In terms of the conference, I know that's not what you're focusing on, but
yes. I'm very much looking forward to the discussions on music, because I'm a savage when it comes to music. I have no idea about music, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, I try and gain what I can about music from these experts. I'm going to steal that. I'm a savage when it comes to music as well, for sure. I do my best though. Yeah. So I don't know if you had any other things. I had a couple things, but Anne, did you have something before I moved on to?
Actually, I was just curious directly about Ayn Rand and sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, I know Leonard Peikoff loves sculpture, and I know that he studied a little bit, and I've seen his work, but that takes a great love. But what did Ayn Rand have strong feelings about sculpture?
I don't know if she did. She said very little about it.
Okay. I know Yaron will talk about it often. Of course, his wife is a sculptress. That was
yes. Yeah. And well, so one thing I'd be, I guess, curious about, that we kind of mentioned this before, and honestly, I'm not even certain how relevant this is to the talk, but just, we have this big shift in the world with the Industrial Revolution, where there's new forms of material to shape. And I'm to new forms, I guess, steel, and I don't know all the history of, when new material become available. But are you aware of how this impacted sculpture in particular at this time? Like how, not just real Romanticism, but just overall, how it might have impacted an artist's thinking and craft on how they're going to use their art? Because I know today that's a big thing. Like people will, in a stupid way, they'll use like toilet paper to make something, right? And they're like, they focus on this medium thing. But back then there was something, if you have like this new steel that's available or something, it might be an interesting heroic, you could create something heroic out of that or something. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Well, there wasn't, in terms of new materials, sculpture pretty much relied on the established materials, stone, cast bronze. Now there was some innovation, of course. You have Eiffel providing the armature for the Statue of Liberty, but the actual work of art itself was not impacted or changed by materials. So the best way of thinking about industrialization and what artists were dealing with is to think of industrialization as a positive. It was good for artists that you had this rapid industrialization. It didn't hinder them. It actually expanded their opportunities. With advances in transportation, whatnot, artists could travel overseas or throughout Europe to Rome, Paris, London, much more easily. They had access to more foundries. They had a growing market, as I mentioned earlier, which frees up the artist to pursue avenues of expression that they might not without. So industrialization was a good thing for artists.
Did it impact reproduction?
Yes, you have the phenomenon. Now, that said, I mean, John Bologna was a Mannerist, post-Renaissance, made statuettes. Statuettes weren't invented in the industrial age. However, you had the phenomenon of artists doing non-commissioned pieces to please themselves, and then making statuettes or smaller castings of it for the domestic market.
And if Kirk, you've never seen John Bologna, you really should. I mean, he's truly fabulous, and your audience might want to look at him. GIAN Bologna. And
Okay. Yeah,
but
I'll
I
check that out.
think of Kirk's question, I'm curious, Sandra, how you feel about the contemporary acrylic work. You know, you go to Carmel, California, and every other gallery is plastic people where you look inside the head and it's illuminated. And how do you feel about sculpture today with other medium?
How do I feel about it? Or
You like it or you hate it?
Yeah.
I'm stealing a line if I say I don't think about it. That said, objects today, and I'll just call them objects or installations or
Installation.
things, they're a result of a profound breach. A breach in cognition. Practitioners today are not interested in reality. They're not interested in the physical worlds, for lack of a better term. And what you're seeing are products of them substituting for what should be their cognitive contact with reality and how they respond to things in the world. So it's entirely subjective today.
Yeah.
And much of it's nihilistic, where it's actually anti-entity or anti-object. So they'll take what remotely resembles a human figure and disembowel it, or split it apart, or hang it upside down, or
they distort perception a lot. Like when I've gone to installations, they'll do stuff to, like, if you can walk around and see it, but it's very specifically not the way you actually see the world, right? Where it's like, I look here and this is how my perception works. I want to see. So like you have to like look at it from here, there. And it's like, that's not how I actually see. And they're trying to make something.
But they dismiss that. It doesn't matter that that's not how you see it. That their aim is not to share with you a cognitive experience.
Okay,
they're deeply opposed to reason. I mean,
yeah. You would not see very many of the archers or any kind of real determination in most new contemporary, especially if it's really considered like high art today.
Well, but even the realist stuff, it tends to get soulless. It's realist and it goes well with your interior design.
Well, I see what you're saying. So the stuff, I
mean, there's a lot of neorealism if you are buying.
I don't know that much about it, but I know of it, like of what, I guess today we have this, I don't know how to describe it, but like another whole branch where it's like, oh, that's artsy, right? When people say that about something where it's some real installation where it's like nobody would ever want this.
Right.
Nobody would ever want this.
The non-objective has stature in our culture.
Yeah. And that's the weird stuff to me. The weirdest.
And tragically, many of the realist artists today don't view what they're doing as objective. They view what they're doing as being a subjective alternative. It's like, well, I'm for I'm for reality, and that's just my thing. Hard to
Yeah.
get your head around that, but
Yeah.
they don't give what they're doing the stature of being objective and what an artwork ought to be.
Which
So
is
as
some.
long as the non-objective has stature, the current revival that we're in is vulnerable to being swept away by the next fad.
Uh-huh.
Which is why we need to resurrect Romanticism as
We
a
need
movement,
to
not just.
resurrect Romanticism by erecting Objectivism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we need to get that out in the culture. And I think
philosophy.
absolutely. And yeah, October 7th through October 9th, Converse University, Spartanburg, South Carolina. There's going to be amazing presenter. You're going to have a lot of music. You'll have David Barry perform, or I think they're putting on an opera that Shoshana Milgram will be talking about as well, which is based on an O. Henry short story.
Yeah, so we talking about
Harry Binswanger will be one of the keynote, or he will be the keynote speaker. You'll have Quentin Linda Cordair from the Cordair Gallery, Diane Durante, John Gillis, and on and on and on. So it's Thomas Showbotham doing performances. So make sure you check this out. Spartanburg, South Carolina, October 7th through the 9th. Okay, so last words before we sign off. And
well, I just wanted to say to Sandra, if you come to Austin, we have the studio of Elizabeth Ney, Ney. So there's a museum that is her studio, which is just a lot of fun to sort of see and see her work. So you might want to look at it online, Ney.
I do hope you come to Austin sometime. Yeah.
Yeah, come to Austin, everybody.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of objectivists here. We will, do some events and have some fun parties and talk about art. So yes. But until then, we can see Sandra on October 7th through the 9th. And okay, thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you, Anne. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you,
I've enjoyed it.
Yes. And everybody watching,
great.
Hopefully you'll go to Spartanburg. And thank you so much. I'll see you next time.
Onward and upward.
Yeah.
There you go.